Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a story where love is pushed to its breaking point. A father who believes love is just a transaction. A woman forced into silence by a cruel threat. And a man who would rather lose everything than give up the people he loves. What happens when power turns ruthless and love refuses to back down? The coffee shop felt quieter than it should have been. Not empty, just muted, like the room had learned how to whisper. Outside, the city slipped into night. Headlights, neon, wet pavement. Inside, James leaned forward, hands loosely clasped, as if he was holding his thoughts in place. His voice came out low but steady. "I came back home for my mother," he said. For the workers who were waiting. For everything I left hanging." Diep sat across from him, shoulders drawn in, both hands around a cup that had already gone lukewarm. Her fingers tightened anyway, like the ceramic could keep her grounded. James watched her closely, reading the small delays in her smile. "As for my father," he paused. "I'm still investigating why he truly opposes us." Diep nodded, careful, restrained. James lowered his voice even more. "But please, don't make things difficult for him. He's still my father." That line landed softly, but it carried weight. "I understand," Diep said. "I don't blame you. I'm glad you went home. Your mother will worry less now." James reached across the table and took her hand. The warmth was immediate, real. For a second, Diep let herself breathe into it, but her mind drifted back to a different voice. Polished stone, cut off contact with him, or you will never see Nye again. Diep swallowed hard and forced her expression to hold. James noticed. Of course he did. "Hey," he murmured, "talk to me. What's going on in your head?" She could tell him. She should. But if she did, James would go straight to his father, fast, raw, unfiltered. And powerful men, when cornered, don't soften. They tighten the leash. "So," Diep squeezed his hand instead. "It's nothing," she lied gently. "Just tired." James didn't look convinced. Still, he didn't push, at least not here, not in public. Instead, he looked into her eyes and said the truth like a vow. "If I wanted everything back, I wouldn't have chosen you," he said. Diep's breath caught. "Because I want to trade it all for you," James continued. "That's why I had to return." The cafe noise blurred. Diep's eyes stung, and she looked down for half a second, afraid he'd see how close she was to breaking. James's phone buzzed. Once. Twice. He glanced at the screen, then turned the phone face down like he didn't want its shadow on the table. Diep's stomach tightened. "Your father?" James nodded. "He's been calling more lately." He tried to smile, but his shoulders stayed tense. "Do you want to go?" Diep asked. "Not while I'm sitting here with you," he said. The phone buzzed again, sharper, impatient. James exhaled. "He thinks control is love," he said quietly. "That if he tightens his grip, people will stay." Diep's mouth went dry. James leaned back slightly, still holding her hand. "Promise me something," he said. "Whatever it is. Pressure, fear, someone saying things to you. Don't carry it alone." Diep's heart pounded. She saw Nye's small fingers clutching her sleeve in her mind. Nye's sleepy voice calling him Uncle James, like it was the safest title on earth. Diep couldn't risk that safety breaking, so she nodded. "I promise." Half true, half desperate. James studied her, wanting to believe her so badly it hurt. Then he stood. "Let's go," he said. "I'll take you home." The cold hit them the moment they stepped outside. James guided her through the crowd, close without crowding her, protective without making a show of it. At the car, he opened the passenger door. When he slid into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "Yes," James said. A pause. Then, "No." Diep stared out the window, pretending she couldn't hear, pretending her body wasn't bracing. James's voice sharpened, controlled but firm. "I'm not staying," he said, "and I'm not negotiating my life like it's a business deal." His hand tightened on the wheel. Then he said slowly, each word deliberate, "I would rather be penniless than be without her." Silence followed, thick, heavy. James ended the call. He started the car. They pulled into traffic, streetlights sliding across their faces like passing judgments. "What did he say?" Diep whispered. James kept his eyes on the road. "He's forbidding me from returning to Vietnam," he said. "He thinks distance will fix it." Diep's chest tightened. "And he's threatening to cut me off," James added. "Or to leave everything to me like it's a chain I should be grateful for." Diep frowned. "Leave everything to you?" James let out a bitter breath. "Every company, every asset, every title if I give you up." His voice softened, but it didn't weaken. "I told him no," James said. "I don't want a life that's bought. I want a life that's chosen." Diep turned her face toward the window, blinking fast. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She froze. James didn't notice. His eyes were on the road. Diep pulled her phone out slowly, tilting it away from him. Unknown number. One short message. Cold. Final. "If you don't cut off contact with him, you will never see Nye again." Diep's breath vanished. Her fingers went numb around the phone, and as James drove forward, believing they were facing this together, Diep realized she was standing alone at the edge of a fear she didn't know how to survive. Night pressed against the car windows like a heavy hand. James kept driving, eyes steady on the road, but his mind was somewhere else. Back in the silence after that call, back in the way his father always spoke like love was a contract. Diep sat rigid in the passenger seat, phone still in her palm, screen dim now. But the message stayed bright behind her eyes. "You will never see Nye again." She didn't cry. Not yet. Fear didn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looked like stillness so tight it hurt. James glanced at her. "You're quiet." "I'm okay," Diep said quickly, too quickly. James didn't answer. He just nodded like he'd heard that lie before. When they reached the apartment, he walked her to the door. His hand hovered near her back, not touching, but close, like he was ready to catch her if she tilted the wrong way. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow I'll figure out my father's next move." Diep forced a small smile. "Don't push too hard." James's eyes sharpened. "Diep, I'm not pushing, I'm protecting." She wanted to believe that protection could reach Nye, too. Inside, Nye was asleep on the couch, curled around a small stuffed toy, face peaceful in a way that felt unfair. Diep stood over her for a long moment, watching her chest rise and fall, as if counting breaths could keep her safe. Diep carried her gently to bed, tucked the blanket under her chin, and sat beside her until her own hand stopped shaking. Then her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. One more line. "Don't test me." Diep's throat tightened. She turned the phone face down like it was poisonous. In the other room, James's voice drifted in from the hallway. He was on his phone again. Quiet. Controlled. "John," James said, "I need to talk. Tonight." An hour later, James sat across from John in a small, dim corner booth of a late-night place that stayed open for people who couldn't sleep. The table between them was sticky. The air smelled like coffee and old heat. James didn't waste time. "Do you remember 5 months ago?" he asked. "When you kept saying my father harmed your family? I still don't fully understand." John stared down at his hands for a moment, like he was deciding whether reopening this would burn him again. Then he spoke. "My father and your father were close friends," John said. "Worked the same cornfield together. They were poor, both of them. Hungry, ambitious, desperate to get out." James listened, jaw set. "They pooled money for a project," John continued, "and it grew into a woodworking factory. But when it was time to sign the real contracts, my father outplayed yours." James's stomach tightened. John's voice stayed calm, but it carried something sharp underneath. "He tricked him," John said. "A contract that left your father with nothing." James exhaled slowly, like each word was cutting into a place he'd tried to keep numb. John leaned forward slightly. "Your father didn't just lose money," John added. "He lost face. He got humiliated in front of people who mattered to him." James's mind flashed to the way Mr. Hone looked at the world, like the world was always about to laugh at him. John kept going. "He swore he'd never be poor again," John said. "And he swore he'd never let anyone use his son the way he believed my father used him." James's fingers curled under the table. "So he thinks Diep is doing the same thing?" James said, voice low. John nodded once. "That's what he believes." A beat of silence. Then John said something that made the room feel colder. "Your father once told me," John said, "that Diep looks very much like her mother." James's eyes lifted fast. "What?" John hesitated. He said it like he recognized her, like he'd seen that face before. The air shifted. James sat still, but inside him something moved, like puzzle pieces clicking into a shape he didn't want. "Perhaps he knew Diep's mother long ago," John added carefully. "Or maybe she's connected to the past in a way you haven't uncovered yet." James stared at John, a quiet storm building behind his eyes. His father's opposition wasn't only class. It wasn't only control. It was personal. It was old. And it was bleeding into the present. James stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. John lifted a hand. "James, don't rush into it." James didn't sit back down. "I'm done being controlled by someone else's trauma," James said. "If there's a secret, I'll find it." John's voice sharpened. "And if finding it puts Diep in danger?" That line stopped James like a hand on his chest. Because danger wasn't hypothetical anymore. Diep's face flashed in his mind. Too quiet, too still, trying too hard to smile. James left the cafe without another word. Outside, the cold air hit him hard. He walked without direction at first, just moving, just trying to keep his emotions from exploding inside his ribs. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "She only wants your money. Love isn't real. People leave when the money leaves." James clenched his hands. He could handle his father's hatred, but he couldn't handle the idea that Diep was being threatened in silence. He pulled out his phone and called her. Diep answered on the second ring, voice cautious. "James? You're not okay," James said immediately. "Tell me the truth." A pause, then, "I'm fine," Diep whispered. James closed his eyes. "Diep," he said, voice breaking just slightly, "I can't protect you from what I don't know." Silence stretched. James heard her breathing, thin, controlled, like she was trying not to fall apart. "Someone texted me," Diep finally said. James went still. "What did they say?" Another pause, longer. Diep's voice came out small. "They said, if I don't cut off contact with you, I'll never see Nee again." James's blood turned cold. His father. It had his father's fingerprints all over it. Control through fear, power through leverage, cruelty dressed up as family protection. James's voice dropped to a low, dangerous calm. "I'm coming back," he said. Diep panicked. "No, James, please. If you come back, he'll get worse." James swallowed, forcing himself to breathe. "Listen to me," he said. "I'm not going to run at him. I'm going to move smart." Diep didn't answer. James continued, slow and firm. "Pack only what you need for you and me," he said. "Tonight. Quietly. Don't tell anyone. Not neighbors, not friends, just you." Diep's breath hitched. "Where would we go?" "Somewhere he can't reach easily," James said. "A place I control. A place with people I trust." Diep's voice trembled. He said, "I'll never see her again." James's chest tightened. "You will," he said, and it sounded like a promise carved into stone. "No one takes her from you." Diep whispered, "What about your father?" James stared up at the dark sky, jaw clenched. "I used to think I could save him from his fear," James said quietly. "But fear doesn't stop on its own. It grows. It becomes ruthless." He paused. "And if he's willing to use Nye, then he's already crossed a line." Diep's voice was barely audible. "James, I love you," James said, simple and raw. "Not your past, not your wounds, not your fear. You." Diep's breath broke. James lowered his voice again. "Tonight you sleep beside me," he said. "You keep the lights low. You lock the door, and you answer only my calls." Diep whispered, "Okay." James ended the call and stood there in the cold, phone still in his hand, feeling the weight of what he'd just stepped into. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. This was a battle between control and love, between old humiliation and the kind of courage that didn't ask permission. James looked down at the streetlights, then whispered to himself, almost like a vow, "I'd rather lose everything than lose them." And somewhere far away, in a house built on fear and pride, Mr. Juan was likely making his own decision, one that could turn this story even darker. Because the question wasn't whether James would fight. He would. The question was what his father would do next, when he realized control was slipping through his fingers.
Ở về nhà, James chọn cách hòa giải và cố gắng hàn gắn những gì mình đã phá vỡ, như chạy đến ôm chầm lấy anh và đòi một lời hứa thực sự, không còn biến mất nữa. Cô bắt James hứa bằng cách dùng ngón tay út kẹp chặt lấy tay cô, lặp đi lặp lại như một nghi lễ cho đến khi cô cảm thấy an toàn. Diệp lặng lẽ chứng kiến khoảnh khắc đó, xúc động đến thực sự tin tưởng tuyệt đối của Nhi, bàng hoàng trước việc cô vẫn muốn tin tưởng James đến thế nào. James trực tiếp xin lỗi Diệp đã bỏ mặc cô một mình trong nỗi sợ hãi và áp lực, và anh hứa sẽ có mặt trong những khoảnh khắc thường nhật, bữa sáng, đưa đón con đi học và những đêm yên tĩnh ở nhà. Diệp thừa nhận mình sợ hãi và James cũng thừa nhận anh cũng vậy, cảnh báo rằng những cơn bão vẫn có thể ập đến